Morningtide was released in 2008 as the second set in Lorwyn Block, and like that set, it's set on the plane of Lorwyn, a Celtic-inspired plane where it is perpetually daytime and midsummer. But Lorwyn also transforms into a dark reflection of itself called Shadowmoor every 300 years, where it is eternally night, and Morningtide is set during the waning moments of Lorwyn before its transformation. I recently did a top 10 on Lorwyn, and I've also covered the two Shadowmoor sets. So when looking at Morningtide, I'll have covered all 4 sets in Lorwyn-Shadowmoor block, and it's a great time to do all of that because Lorwyn Eclipsed comes out early next year, marking our first return to the plane since the original Lorwyn-Shadowmoor block. We recently saw that Lorwyn was an incredibly strong and important set with tons of cards that have had a lasting impact on Magic. As a smaller set, Morningtide isn't quite as deep as Lorwyn, but this list also features several multi-format all-stars, especially in the top half. To be eligible for this list, a card had to receive its original printing in Morningtide. In all, there were 141 cards that qualified, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. Here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point, this includes events like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Deglamer. For 1 generic and a green, it's an instant, and you choose target artifact or enchantment, and its owner shuffles it into their library. This is a twist on a typical naturalize effect, since it doesn't full-on destroy the target. While that can be a bit of a downside, in your typical game of Magic, it's often pretty good to shuffle a permanent away because chances are you'll never see it again, and you still answered whatever you target with this. And precisely because it doesn't destroy, it can even deal with indestructibility, and if a permanent has a death trigger, you don't have to worry about it, and if your opponent has lots of ways to get cards back from the graveyard, you don't have to worry about that either. And in corner cases, you can even go after your own enchantment or artifact, although that's not worthwhile most of the time. As a result of all of this, this has been a frequent sideboard card in multiple formats over the years, including Extended, Modern, and even Vintage. It's been played the most, though, in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal. There it's particularly useful against affinity decks, which heavily rely on artifact lands, including the indestructible Bridge cycle. When Deglamer can be a land destruction spell on top of everything else, it gets extra good. Right now, Pauper is the only format it's active in, and it's going to continue to accumulate top 8s in that format, giving it some chance at moving higher on the list in the future. At number 9, it's Murmuring Bosk. It's a land with the forest type, and when it enters, you can reveal a tree folk from your hand, and if you don't, it enters tapped. It can also tap for a white or black, and when it does that, it deals 1 damage to you. In the Lorwyn top 10, we saw that this block's emphasis on creature types and payoffs for them wasn't very well represented, with only 1 such card making an appearance. For the Morningtide top 10, you can expect to see more cards in that category, like the Bosk. A land that can tap for 3 colors that enters tapped is already pretty solid, especially when it comes with the forest type, so you can find it with fetch lands and the like, but obviously it gets way better if you've got a tree folk in your hand as it enters untapped. The Bosk was particularly good alongside one of the best tree folk of all time, Doran the Siege Tower, a tree folk who required 1 mana of each of the colors that the Bosk produces. Because it changes how combat damage is done, it is effectively a 3 mana 5/5, one that potentially wreaks havoc on your opponent's creatures who have higher power and toughness, and makes your higher toughness creatures even better. This was very much a winning strategy in Block Standard and Extended, with each of those formats having decks simply called Doran. One of the other key cards in the deck was Treefolk Harbinger, a 0/3 Treefolk that can tutor up a forest or a Treefolk and put it on top. That meant it could grab the Bosk when you needed it, or Doran if you could already cast him, which would also effectively turn the Harbinger into a 3/3. However, the Bosk gave great mana even outside of Doran decks, like in Standard and Extended Elves, Extended Bant Control decks, and Modern Birthing Pod. These decks often had a few cards they could reveal to have it enter untapped, like Nameless Inversion, a removal spell with all creature types, but it typically entered tapped in those decks and it was still pretty good. However, we just keep getting better lands, and the Ikoria Tri-lands especially have really supplanted the Bosk, since they each have 3 land types, making it even easier to grab them. Murmuring Bosk doesn't have any top 8 since 2017, and I would guess it's going to remain inactive for the foreseeable future, assuming our return to Lorwyn doesn't include a reprint of it and or a bunch of broken Treefolk, and neither of those things is entirely impossible. At number 8, it's Reveillark. For 4 generic and a white, it's a 4/3 flyer. When it leaves the battlefield, you can return up to 2 target creature cards with power 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. It also has Evoke, a mechanic introduced in Lorwyn that appears on elementals. It's an alternate casting cost, and in this case, it costs 5 generic and a white. And if you go the Evoke route, Reveillark is immediately sacrificed. In other words, you're mostly just paying for the leaves the battlefield trigger when that's what you do. Reveillark is actually kind of unusual in that its Evoke cost is more expensive than its normal casting cost, but most other cards with Evoke have an enters trigger instead of a leaves trigger, so it makes sense. Anyway, obviously, Reveillark can provide a ton of value. It gives you a reasonably efficient body, one that was more impressive back in 2008, and if your opponent ever kills it or you evoke it, you get to reanimate 2 small creatures from the graveyard. That's serious card advantage. Reveillark supplies so much value that it helped spawn an eponymous deck in Standard and Extended. While you're usually not going to break the game by reanimating small creatures the way Reveillark does, there were lots of good ones in Standard to bring back, like other evoke creatures like Muldrifter, who you could use to draw a couple of cards when you evoked it, and then later Reveillark could bring it back and give you that powerful enters trigger again, and this time Muldrifter would stick around. These decks could also treat the graveyard very much as a toolbox, running other nice creatures to recur, like Venser and Sower of Temptation. While Reveillark decks were at their most successful in Standard, decks that played Reveillark were also pretty successful in Extended, especially in Fauna Shaman decks, which treated their whole deck like a toolbox and could load the graveyard with the Shaman too, so tutoring up Reveillark was a pretty sweet play. Reveillark has also been used in modern creature toolbox decks like Birthing Pod decks before they got banned out of existence. Sacrificing Reveillark to the pod was pretty great since you wouldn't lose any board presence because you'd reanimate 2 things that you sacrificed earlier, and then you could grab a big scary creature. These decks often had creature-based combos too, and Reveillark could help you bring back those combo pieces. Reveillark's success continued even after the pod was banned, showing up in the similar Collected Company and Court of Calling decks for a while. However, Reveillark hasn't done much in Modern or any format for a while. It enjoyed a short-lived renaissance in Modern between 2021 and 2023, during which time Risen Reef elemental decks rose to the top of the format, but Reveillark was far from a regular fixture in the deck, and it doesn't have any points at all since 2023, so it's in danger of losing its spot on the list in the future. At number 7, it's Shard Volley. For 1 red mana, it's an instant that requires you to sacrifice a land as an additional cost to cast it, and it does 3 damage to any target. So yeah, in most ways, it's a worse Lightning Bolt. Its main effect might be the same, but requiring you to give up a land is a pretty big cost. That said, Lightning Bolt is one of the best Magic cards of all time, and even a pale imitation of it, including this, which requires you to 2-for-1 yourself, is still a pretty good card. It saw some play in Standard and Extended, but it's made the biggest name for itself in Modern, a format where it's seen a little bit of play every year since the format was created in 2011. Modern burn decks have access to a ton of ways to do 3 damage for 1 mana, and any card that can do that for a reasonable cost tends to see play in them. Their curve is so low that they don't have to worry a ton about giving up lands, and the Volley has even had some occasional additional upside in the deck over the years, such as helping you get Threshold for your Barbarian Ring or loading your graveyard for Grim Lavamancer. It's also used, of course, in Pauper. It's still seeing play in Modern right now, but it's never really been a heavily played card in the format, just one that's seen consistent play for a long time, and all the cards ahead of it on the list have a huge lead over it and or are more active, so this is probably the best the Volley can ever do. At number 6, it's Heritage Druid. For 1 green mana, it's a 1/1 elf, and you can tap 3 untapped elves you control to add 3 green. Obviously, the Druid does a great job of generating mana in an elf deck, and one of the most important things about this ability is that even elves who have just entered the battlefield can be tapped for it. That very fact is what makes this incredibly good as a source of mana in elf combo decks especially. The first such deck showed up in Extended, and it looked to cast Glimpse of Nature alongside the Druid, and then just draw the entire library. Every elf you would play would draw you a card, and every elf you play could also be tapped for mana thanks to the Druid. Things would get particularly absurd once you got some Nettle Sentinels in the mix, because they all untap every time you cast a green spell. So once they're around, the combo doesn't end until the player finds their win condition, which in Extended would be Grape Shot with a huge storm count or a Court of Calling Predator Dragon that would swing for lethal immediately. Ultimately, the elf-based combo decks powered by the Druid proved so powerful that Wizards of the Coast banned Glimpse of Nature when Modern was created a few years later, since they didn't want this kind of fast combo deck dominating the format, and Glimpse has never been legal in Modern. Heritage Druid has still seen play in elf decks in the format though, even without the Glimpse combo, because the deck can still produce absolutely insane amounts of mana with it and other elves before winning with Uzuri Renegade Leader's activated ability. However, Legacy is where the Druid has been at its best, since Glimpse of Nature is still legal there, and the format also has Natural Order, which makes it much easier for you to find a way to win, as grabbing a Craterhoof Behemoth on a board full of elves is an immediate game over. Heritage Druid is going to continue powering elf decks in Legacy while also seeing occasional play in Modern, so it should be able to maintain a spot on this list. Heritage Druid can make elves tap for mana, and I want to ask you to tap the subscribe button. I'm trying to hit 100,000 subscribers this year, and I'd really appreciate it if you help me get there. At number 5, it's Scapeshift. For 2 generic and 2 green, it's a sorcery that has you sacrifice any number of lands, then you search your library for up to that many lands and put them onto the battlefield tapped. So it takes some setup in the form of lands, but its ability to grab multiple lands of any kind all at once, including any non-basics you might want, is pretty much unrivaled, especially for only 4 mana, and indeed its top 8s have all come in decks that look to cast Scapeshift quickly and generate absurd game-winning value. The first deck to achieve this appeared in Extended, where you would ramp mana and then cast Scapeshift and grab as many mountains and Valakuts as you could. Because of how the trigger works on Valakut, putting all those mountains and Valakuts into play at the same time means that every mountain will trigger every Valakut, provided you grabbed at least 5. This makes it easy to do lethal to the opponent. When the Modern format was created in 2011 to replace Extended, Valakut was initially banned because of concerns about the combo, but it got unbanned in 2012, and for a long time, Scapeshift decks were at the top of the pile in Modern. More recently, Scapeshift has shifted into Amulet Titan decks, which don't do anything with Valakut, but they do run tons of powerful lands that would normally enter tapped, and Scapeshift being able to search up lands that enter untapped opens up a whole new world of possibilities. After Scapeshift got reprinted in Core Set 2019, it also put up its first top 8s in Standard, this time alongside Field of the Dead, a land that generates a 2/2 black zombie creature token anytime it or another land enters under your control, provided you control 7 or more lands with different names. As with Valakut, this means that when you give up your lands and search up the field and a bunch of other lands with different names, you'll end up getting a 2/2 for each and every one of them immediately. Field of the Dead ultimately got banned in Standard, as well as Pioneer and Modern, which has limited how successful Scapeshift could be in those formats, but it does still see play in Pioneer landfall decks, which can use Scapeshift and Spelunking alongside Nissa and Omnath to generate tons of value. Scapeshift is going to continue to put up top 8s going forward and should be able to hang on to a spot on the list. At number 4, it's Bitterblossom. For 1 generic and a black, it's a Kindred enchantment, Fairy. The name of this type was originally tribal, and while it showed up on 1 card in Future Sight, Lorwyn Block was the first time that this type was used significantly. Basically what it means is that this card has all the characteristics that a creature with this type would have. Basically, payoffs you have for fairy stuff apply to Bitterblossom, even though it's an enchantment. While all of that stuff's great, it's really just the text box that makes Bitterblossom a very powerful card. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life and create a black 1/1 fairy rogue creature token with flying. This delivers insane value, and when it comes down on turn 2, it's incredibly difficult to beat just because your opponent gets a free 1/1 flyer every turn. And yeah, they lose some life too, but it's well worth the cost. Bitterblossom is just inherently strong, and it gets all the more powerful because the fairy creature type is incredibly well supported, and that was especially true during the days of Lorwyn-Shadowmoor. Once you combine Bitterblossom with amazing payoffs like Spellstutter Sprite and Scion of Una, you can see what I mean, and Bitterblossom was probably the best card in a deck that was already very, very good. Fairy decks quickly asserted themselves in Block Standard and Extended, and when Modern was created in 2011, Bitterblossom, like Scapeshift, was one of the cards that received a preliminary ban, and it didn't become legal in the format until 2014. After getting unbanned, it did start to see play in the format, although it never became as dominant as it had been in formats like Standard and Extended. It sees occasional play in Modern and Legacy outside of Fairy decks too, as it's a particularly good card against decks that are reliant on spot removal, because that will never solve the problem of Bitterblossom. All that said, so far in 2025, Bitterblossom doesn't have any top 8s, but it is definitely a card to keep an eye on as we head back to Lorwyn early next year, as it wouldn't take very much for it once again to be great. At number 3, it's Vendilion Clique, our second consecutive fairy. For 1 generic and 2 blue, it's a legendary 3/1 flyer with flash, and when it enters, you look at target player's hand, and choose a non-land card from it, and if you do that, the player reveals the chosen card, puts it on the bottom of their library, and draws a card. The Clique gives you a relatively high power evasive creature for the cost, but it's that enters trigger that really makes it great. Typically, one wants to target the opponent with it since it has such a nice disruptive effect, letting you get rid of their best card. And sure, they get a card back when you do it, but on average the best card in their hand is better than the card on top of their library. The Clique can also target you, in which case you'll give up the most useless card in your hand to draw a card. It's kind of like a loot effect. Getting that powerful trigger when you play a creature that can also be a legit win condition is pretty powerful. Additional, being blue and having flash gets you some extra points, since blue decks really like leaving their mana up for counterspells and other instant speed things, and the Clique allows you to do that, but helps you avoid getting punished by your opponent playing around your counter magic. The Clique is seen play in every format it's ever been legal in, which is usually a really good indicator of a card's power, and it's certainly seen play in fairy decks, but for a time it was pretty close to being a staple in blue tempo decks across multiple formats. It has definitely slowed down in recent years though, since the printing of Brazen Borrower, who often appears in the slot that was once reserved for the Clique. It's got the same mana cost, keywords, and stats, but it's way more flexible because you can cast it as a disruptive spell first, which makes it a creature that can trigger prowess and stuff like that. The Clique does still see a little bit of play in Modern, and its massive score is going to make it hard for other cards on the list to surpass it, but number 3 is probably the best the Clique can do, since the 2 cards in front of it already have a lead and are still highly active. At number 2, it's Negate. To be honest, when I went into this list, I didn't even remember that Negate was originally printed in Morningtide, since it has been reprinted a ton in the years since then. For one generic and a blue, it's an instant that counters target non-creature spell. While it is restricted on what it can go after, it is really efficient and easy to cast, and that has made it a really great counterspell. One that's been good enough to see play everywhere, even in Vintage. Most decks in most formats have at least a few non-creature spells, and for that reason, Negate even sees regular main deck play, but it is slightly more commonly a sideboard card to bring in against decks that are particularly reliant on non-creatures, which includes most combo and control decks. Its multiple runs through Standard have allowed it to put up a particularly ridiculous score in that format, but it also sees regular play right now in Pioneer, Modern, and Pauper, and it's definitely got a chance at one day surpassing the number 1 card on the list, especially if it keeps getting reprinted. But for now, the number 1 card is Mutavault. It's a land that can tap for colorless, and you can also pay 1 generic mana to make it a 2/2 creature with all creature types until end of turn. So even if this didn't gain all creature types when you animated it, it'd be a really good land, as paying only a single mana to turn it into a 2/2 whenever you need one is pretty great. It almost feels like card advantage when you have a land around that can give you mana when you need it to, and be a creature whenever you need it to. Then, once you throw in the fact that it has every creature type, things get really interesting, as giving Mutavault all the buffs and bonuses you have for creature types makes it an even more imposing creature. This has led to it seeing play in every single format, finding a use in at least every typal deck there is, like various fairy, vampire, human, goblin, merfolk, elf, and Eldrazi decks. But it also appears in tons of decks with little to no payoffs for a specific creature type, simply on the basis of its efficiency. Aggro decks especially tend to like it, as it gives them a way to pressure the opponent, and it's a creature who can survive a dreaded Wrath effect. Mutavault's going to continue to amass points in multiple formats, and it will be interesting to see if it can hold off Negate in the long run. So those are the top 10 cards in Morningtide. If you want to own any of these powerful cards, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at specific sets, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.